Hi everyone and welcome to In Good Company. I'm Nicolai Tangen and I am the CEO of the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. And today I'm joined by somebody who I think probably is the world's greatest connector of ideas, people and art. Hans Ulrich Obrist is the artistic director of the Serpentine Galleries in London and widely considered the best art curator in the world. You created unbelievable amounts of exhibitions, and today we're going to tease out the reasons behind your success, creativity, how to connect with people, and what business can learn from all the kind of things you've done. So warm welcome.
Thank you, very nice to see you.
What does an art curator actually do?
Yeah, I've always followed this definition the writer J.G. Ballard gave me when he didn't really understand what was my profession, so I was describing it to him, and he says, so basically what you're doing is you're a junction maker. You create unexpected connections, and I think that's kind of what is at the core of my practice. It's bringing artworks together, bringing people together, creating situations, and using also the exhibition as a kind of a medium to create experiences.
What's the key to create interesting experiences?
I mean, I think the first, probably most important step is to listen. The poet Nicolai Tangen said once that we sort of need to learn to listen again. And I think listening to artists is always the beginning. So I would go to studios. It's something I've been doing ever since I'm a teenager. When I was like 16, 17, I traveled all over Europe by night train, and I went to see artists from Gerhard Richter to Rosemarie Trockel to Louis Bourgeois, to Annette Messager, to Fischli Weiss. So artists kind of all over Europe initially, and then also outside Europe, and would just listen to them. And of course also kind of find out what they would like to do. So rather than to somehow squeeze their practice into a kind of a framework, it's to basically kind of listen what they've maybe not been able to do in the context of the art world. So how we can basically change the art world or shift it slightly to make this artist dream become a reality. So in a way, to come back to your initial question, what is a curator? I think it's also about enabling, about making things possible.
Now you put together things which weren't meant to be together often.
Yeah.
What's the key to get kind of diverse things to play together?
I mean, I think the key is to not stop the serendipity, because very often it's a chain reaction, and it's not necessarily a master plan. I think very often when an exhibition has a checklist early on, and one would say that's what we're going to do, it's very limited. I think we go on a journey, we go into the unknowable, and on this path, we have to be open for many different surprises. So one of my bigger projects of the last years has been my kind of handwriting project, and that is an example for that, these two little books, and it's also my Instagram account. And we basically, I was with Umberto Eco, the writer and scholar, and he was very old, and he said basically we need to do something to save handwriting, and so kind of left his apartment with this task somehow. And I wasn't of course qualified to do that because I'm not a calligrapher, nor could I found a calligraphy school. Then in a way I was with the poet Nicolai Tangen, whom I quoted earlier, who said that we have to learn to listen again. And she also told me that we shouldn't forget that handwriting matters. And she started whilst we were in a cafe to write a very beautiful poem in her notebook. And suddenly I realized I am with artists, with poets, with writers, with architects every day. So I could just ask them to write something and make my social media, give it a mission, no? Because in a way, I didn't really know what to do with Instagram and with social media. I knew that I, didn't want it to be about selfies. I knew that it didn't want to be about food. I didn't want it to be about my travels. It needed to have a mission, a purpose. And then I thought, wow, so I could actually do what Umberto Eco told me. And so in a way, it's this serendipity which leads to projects. I think it's to be open and to be curious and let things flow.
Not many people actively believe in serendipity. I kind of love it because it brings out surprising things. What is your relationship to serendipity?
I think in a way, the idea of an encounter with artists can lead us somewhere where we would never have thought, or we would never think we could go. And I think that's what very often is the serendipity of such project. But it's also, I think, the idea of going beyond short-termism. I think we live in a world which is very much sort of ruled by short-termist deadlines, by deadlines where for a certain moment or up to a certain moment something has to happen, and that's of course true in every field. It's also true in my field. The exhibition has to open, but I think very often it's interesting that we go on a journey and that an exhibition has a longer life than that. Some of my exhibitions have been evolving for more than 30 years. We started a project called Do It, where I ask artists to write instructions and recipes, and basically people, museums, people at home, people everywhere in the world can interpret and can basically do the artwork themselves. And so that project has been on the road for 33 years now, and it's never stopped. There has always been a new version. It keeps learning, it keeps evolving. I think the idea also that exhibitions in a way don't start from this idea that they know everything, that we kind of set up vehicles or structures which can learn is very important.
What's the recipe for a great exhibition?
I mean, I don't think that there is one recipe. I think that in a way an exhibition needs to kind of come up with new rules of the game. It needs to kind of come up with new connections, new encounters. It needs to create an experience we haven't had before, and very often it's also bringing disciplines together. I mean, for example, we've just had an exhibition at Serpentine of Peter Doig, and talking to the artists, we figured out that his desire is really to bring the world of art, painting and music together. And little by little we realized that it also includes poetry, because he collaborated with poets. And so we created an exhibition. We invited him basically to create an exhibition at Serpentine where on the one hand he presented new paintings, at the same time he transformed the exhibition space into a listening space. People could sit down, they could have a chat, they could have a conversation, they could also lie down and just chill. And they could listen to his music, they could listen to the music he has basically in his studio, he plays in his studio, but they could also come for special events. There were these basically sessions every Sunday. So it means that people came actually not only once to see the exhibition, but all of a sudden you have people who came every Sunday, who came every day to listen to new music. And so in a way created a completely new experience, and also in a way binds people to spend more time, because on average people spend very little time in front of an artwork in a museum, a few seconds, sometimes longer. But I think it's interesting when we create an exhibition.
Are you fast when you go through exhibitions? Because I'm really fast.
I'm fast until I'm not. If all of a sudden I'm fascinated, then I can spend a lot of time. So it's kind of both. But I think it's interesting that we create multi-sensory experiences where actually visitors can spend more time, as they did, in Peter Doig's exhibition.
What's your imprint on this? Where can we see Obrist in your exhibitions?
I mean, in terms of solo exhibitions, when we do solo exhibitions at Serpentine, we most of the time invite artists to take over the space and create their world and show, their work as a kind of a world building. Then I think it's an enabling, it's making that possible. It's of course very different with group shows. With group shows, the curator kind of defines in dialogue with the artist the rule of the game. I mean, we are working right now with my colleague Ben Vickers and Soundwalk Collective on the Vatican Pavilion, the Holy See Pavilion for the Venice Biennale, which is going to open next month. And there we basically came up with this idea of this interdisciplinary figure, this saint Hildegard von Bingen, who lived in the 11th century. And so many musicians and artists today are inspired by her composing, by her music, by her writing, by the way she connected also to nature, by the way she kind of connected to healing, because she was also a healer. So we decided to kind of, in dialogue with artists, to sort of do a garden, a sound garden in Venice. It's a hidden garden near the railway station, and this garden is basically going to be accessible for the exhibition, and visitors will come there and listen to sound interpretations of 21st century artists, from Blood Orange to Patti Smith to the Bong Nakanga. Many different artists will interpret Hildegard von Bingen's work for today. So here we kind of, would define a rule of the game in which then the different artists can intervene. So it depends a lot if it's a solo show or a group show.
Tell me about the importance of multisensory exhibitions. What does it do to the visitor?
You mean when an exhibition addresses multiple senses? What happens? How do you think
about it? I mean, how many senses do you want to engage?
I I mean,
And is more senses better?
I mean, I think we can never say an exhibition has to be this or that way, because each time it's a different situation. But I think if we want to bind the viewer, and if we want the viewer to spend more time in an exhibition, it's important to appeal to multiple senses, definitely. And I think that's something, I mean, the example of Peter Doig is the case in point. People spend hours, they kept coming back. And that's also what's happening, for example, with our experiments with technology. When I joined the Serpentine in 2006, we started to think about what could be new departments, and we started to basically introduce an ecological sort of department, so as to say, where we looked at the environmental aspects of what the museum does. But we also felt it would be important to kind of connect to technology, because around 2012, 2013, most of the museum work with technology happened maybe on the website, but it wasn't really central in museums, but it was clear that it would become a very important kind of dimension of art of the future. So we started kind of new experiments in art and technology. And many of these exhibitions are very multisensory. We created, for example, exhibitions with video games, because today more than 3 billion people play video games. It's what was a niche medium, has become one of the lead mediums of our time. Many visual artists are engaging with that medium. So we created kind of mixed reality installation, physical installations by artists with video game components. And that again, exhibitions, for example, of Gabriel Massan and also Daniel Braithwaite-Shirley and others, these exhibitions really bind the viewer, and visitors spend a lot of time. And it also brought in a completely new generation of kind of visitors who otherwise wouldn't visit the museum. So we also kind of think in relation to that, it's interesting to create new alliances, to kind of connect, because obviously museums always work with other museums, but we think it's interesting to create new alliances also with brands, with companies in technology. So for example, for the Cars exhibition, we partnered up with Fortnite, and that partnership meant that all of a sudden Serpentine was on the landing page of Fortnite, and we had in 2 weeks 150 million visitors on that space, which is more than any exhibition we've ever done. And that brought us a lot of visitors into the physical space, because the same exhibition basically happened in the virtual space on Fortnite, and in the physical space, the physical paintings were actually in the gallery. And all of a sudden, teenagers brought their parents to the Serpentine, which in a way otherwise would be the other way around. Or also, the same thing happened with K-pop. We did a whole collaboration with BTS and K-pop and the young artist Jakob Knut-Steensen. And all of a sudden, the world of contemporary art and the world of K-pop came together.
Yeah. Are the best artists also the most technically accomplished, or using modern technology in a better way? Is there a correlation there?
I think that...
Because I remember I saw a Hackney exhibition where he had drawn on iPads, right? You remember that probably from the Royal Academy.
Yeah, at the moment we actually show an exhibition of David Hockney at Serpentine, which just opened, and it's there until early September, late August. He's always gone beyond paintings. He's a painter who always had the curiosity to go into other fields. So he wrote Secret Knowledge, which is a book. At the same time, he worked with opera. He worked with opera sets and theater sets. And then he always came back to painting. And then I would say already in the 80s, he was very fascinated by technology, but it was too slow for him. It's just that drawing was still faster. But then around 2006, 7, 8, 9, I don't remember exactly the year, but about approximately 20 years ago, 18 years ago, he started to all of a sudden really experiment more with technology. And then he started to make these extraordinary works on the iPad. And initially it was flowers and then landscapes. And it really intensified when during the lockdown he was in Normandy in France. And he created this amazing work a year in Normandy. And it's of course a very physical, deeply embodied piece, because it's printed, it fills the gallery, it's a panorama. It's in a way an homage to Bayeux, one can say. It's inspired by the tapestry of Bayeux. So it's interesting because later this year...
It's now coming to the British Museum.
It's coming to the British Museum. So our show is basically ending when that starts. So it's kind of a segue almost. And for Hockney, it was very inspiring to visit the tapestry of Bayeux. He created hundreds of works outdoors, a bit like Monet. The Impressionist would paint plein air. Hockney was plein air, but he wasn't there with the easel And the paint, he was there with his iPad, and he was basically painting, and then combined about 100 of these works into one very long work, which is inspired by Bayeux, and which is basically going around the corners of the space. So one has to walk in order to experience it. And then at the same time, you know, he would return again to painting as he always did. And in the two powder rooms in Serpentine North, the two central spaces, there are two new paintings. So yeah, that's definitely, it's a very physical experience, but it's being created using technology. And it took him a long time to basically learn how to use that tool.
What's going to be the function of AI in art?
I think it's interesting right now to see how many artists are working with AI. And we started, of course, when we 12 years ago began these experiments in art and technology at Serpentine. We quite early on also focused on AI. Last year we had an exhibition of Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst, and they worked with choirs all over the UK. They created a book of hymns, and this is the book of hymns basically, which then was interpreted by these different choirs, and the choirs kind of are forming, these recordings are forming a data set, and visitors could actually experience this data set, because normally one wouldn't see and understand how a data set actually works. It's kind of opaque.
But does it matter for you whether art is created by AI or people?
I think it's always both. I mean, the case of Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst, the artist worked with people, and it was a collaborative situation with AI. And what was interesting is that, I mean, Paul Klee once said that art makes the invisible visible. And in a way, a lot of kind of AI functions we use, we don't really understand and don't really know. They're kind of opaque. We don't really understand how it works. And they really wanted to make the process of forming a data set visible, audible for the viewer. And then I think at the same time, choirs are a very old coordination technology, and AI is a form of coordination technology. So they created that connection. Interestingly enough, it was for the viewer or for the visitor who came to Serpentine and experienced this AI work, the call of Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst, also a way to understand how actually artists can use a data set and AI ethically. And the same thing also happened with Refik Anadol. I mean, Refik Anadol created this very immersive installation in close collaborations, of course, also with Google. He's been collaborating with them for a long time, with NVIDIA, and he created very big data sets, but all ethically sourced, Smithsonian, from National Geographic. So I think it's interesting also how artists can set an example how AI data sets can be ethically sourced.
Hans Ulrich, let's talk about relationships. What is key to establishing good relationships with artists?
I think relationships with artists are about liberating time. I think it's something which always begins with a studio visit. It begins with a long conversation. So I think it's something which has to do also with attention.
You visit them typically in the galleries?
I would make studio visits. I mean, some artists don't have a physical studio, then we meet in a cafe, but that's also a studio visit. Yeah, I do that. I do that every day.
How many artists have you visited?
I mean, I've been doing it since 1986, because I started when I was a teenager, so it's been 40 years. So if you would think that on average I visit the studio a day, it's 40 times 365.
It's a lot, huh? You also record some of your conversations.
Yeah, I started at a certain moment in the early 90s to record them. I mean, initially, because I didn't really remember everything artists told me, but also because I started to think that maybe it could be interesting for the future as a document to have the voices recorded. I basically was very inspired by Vasari and how Vasari wrote the lives of the artists and wrote the lives of the architects. I was very inspired by the book of...
So this was during the Renaissance?
Yeah, the Renaissance, and then more recently David Sylvester, who in the 20th century would talk again and again to artists like Philip Gaston or Francis Bacon, as a matter of fact. He did a whole book of his conversations with Francis Bacon.
Incredible book.
And it's an incredible book. And I read that book as a teenager, and I started to think, because I have this I started to have this long-term relationship with artists that I could maybe do something similar. I could sort of record, and I mean today it's the archive is about 4,500 hours. So it is a data set.
What are you going to do with it?
I don't know yet completely. I mean, so far.
So that's the most comprehensive collection of interviews in the world, right?
Yeah, it's probably, I don't know, but it's definitely also not only very broad, but it's also, you know, deep in the sense of that I would talk to the same artists again and again. With certain artists, I have 20, 30, 40 interviews over the years because I would interview them every year, a couple of times.
Do you ask the same questions?
Yeah, there is a couple of recurrent questions.
What are they? What are they?
So one question I always ask is the question about the unrealized projects, because I do think it's very interesting. I mean, I think we all, not only in the art world, we all do have unrealized projects. And it's interesting that it's only in very few professions that actually these unrealized projects are being published. I mean, architects do publish them because the competition culture, in a way, the architectural competition very often leads to them being published. But we know very little about poets, visual artists, filmmakers. But I suppose also in your field, we, at the end of the day, don't know a lot about CEOs and unrealized projects. So I think it's interesting.
But what can we learn? What can we learn from them? So let's say now we interview a CEO. Hey, what is your unrealized project? What do you think we can learn from that concept?
I think what we can learn is, now it's an interesting question what we can learn from it, but I think in terms of artists, what we can definitely learn is what maybe we need to kind of look at the range of the unrealized projects. I think there are many different types of unrealized projects. There are certain projects which are too big to be realized. There are certain projects which are too time intense to be realized. There are certain projects which are maybe unrealizable. They're utopias, they're dreams. There are certain projects which are censored. That can be a reason for it not being realized. And then, of course, there is also projects which are self-censored. Doris Lessing, the writer, always said one category not to be underestimated is the self-censorship, projects we would like to do but don't dare to do. And I mean, in terms of the art world, very often artists have projects outside their kind of daily routine because they're basically invited to be in biennials, artists are invited to do gallery shows, they're invited to do museum shows, they're invited to participate in collection exhibitions, but very often they have projects outside these parameters. And these are very often the most interesting projects. And so then we need to think, how could we make them happen? No?
Of course, the obvious follow-up here is, what is your unrealized project?
Yeah, so my unrealized project, it's a long list because I think a lot of exhibitions, I wanted to do early on fell through, and I still, one way or the other, would like to do some of them. The Hildegard von Bingen project we are doing now with Ben Vickers and the Soundwalk Collective and these different artists is one of these unrealized projects. We always wanted to do something about Hildegard von Bingen, so that's now happening. I always also felt, having organized many exhibitions, worked in museums, being the artistic director of an institute at Serpentine, I've always been thinking, what is missing in the art world? And I think what is really missing today is a kind of a new Black Mountain College. What is missing is...
What is that?
The Black Mountain College was this extraordinary school in the US after the Second World War. Joseph Albers taught there, Cage, Buckminster Fuller. It was a very interdisciplinary moment where art, architecture, music, science, it all sort of came together. And I think today there is a real necessity for such a school. I think and that's something we're starting to work on, because Lorraine Powell Jobs basically saved this building, the San Francisco Art Institute. When that ended, there was a very big question what it would become in the future, and it has this Diego Rivera painting, and she decided to actually buy it and then guarantee that it would be a school, for the future, and ask Abby Churchill and me to work with her together on ideas how such a school could be. And so that's definitely a still unrealized project, which now will be realized, which I think can be very exciting.
Do you ever think about the fact that you have to sell tickets?
Yeah, can I finish on the unrealized projects?
Yes.
Because there's a couple of no.
You do.
And also, I haven't answered your question.
You have a long list. You have a long list of unfinished projects.
Yeah, I mean, I think another question, because maybe the unrealized project we did enough, but you ask me what questions I always ask.
Yeah.
My favorite question is about the unrealized project, because I think it's interesting what people would like to do outside the box, outside their parameters in which they work. Because I think very often people have dreams, people have unrealized projects which they would want to do, but they're somehow caught in a daily routine, or maybe they're caught also by the parameters of their industry. And very often these projects, could actually be very exciting. Then I think the second question which I always ask is, what's your advice to a young artist? What's your advice to a young curator? What's your advice to a young practitioner? The kind of Rainer Maria Rilke question, when he wrote this wonderful little book, which is an advice to a young poet. I would say another question I always ask is, who were your mentors? What was the most important message you received from a mentor? Another question I always ask is the way a practitioner connects to other practitioners. So have they been part of a group? Has this group had a manifesto? Are there individual practitioners outside the group? It's interesting because obviously in my archive of more than 4,000 hours, a lot of the conversations connect to each other. And so it's interesting, how artists connect to other artists.
Do you connect to other curators?
Yeah, definitely. I've always had conversations with colleagues from the beginning. I mean, initially with people who were much older than me. I mean, I was very lucky to have these great mentors. And I think mentorship is super important. I think that we can mentor the next generation, and that's what happened when I began. I had, a mentor in Caspar Koenig and in Suzanne Paget, two great professionals who were like 20, 30 years older than me, and taught me the profession in a way. Yeah.
You started to travel around and meeting artists when you were a teenager. What would you have told your young person then, your young self?
The advice. Yeah, it's interesting because I've just written a text about that. I need to find it, of 7 points, which... How
much do you actually write? Because here I got 6 books, and I think you all written them recently. And, I did read your Life in Progress book over Christmas, and I totally loved it.
Thank you.
But how much do you write?
Yeah, about... in a way, I always write early in the morning when I kind of wake up, and then I try to liberate some time in the morning before going to the office. I do some sports, and then I write, and so I try to write a little bit every day. And then, of course,
you publish a book how often?
Maybe 7 books a year.
7 books a year.
Yeah, but lots of them are conversation books.
Yeah, sure. So what did you write about?
Yeah, so the advice to a young curator or creator is kind of a DIY idea, that the work can start anywhere, to be curious and learn constantly. I think to build long-term relationships. You asked me before about relationships. I think it's important that these are lasting, evolving dialogues with artists and other practitioners. I think a protest against forgetting, that's also why I record these conversations, because I think we live in an age where we have more and more information, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we have more memory. The protest against forgetting, to embrace collaboration, I think, to facilitate and foster new alliances, and to be global and local at the same time, I think is maybe another important aspect. And then I think to follow what excites you and meet it with enthusiasm, and probably most importantly, that generosity is at the core of everything. That in a way, my advice would always be to someone to kind of be generous, to kind of have almost like generosity as a medium.
Well, these are very powerful thoughts. Where is the art going now?
I think the future, as Martha Russell once says, always flies in under the radar, and we can't really predict the future of art. It would be preposterous for me to do that. I learn from artists every day, but I think what we can see right now, we can talk about the extreme present, what's happening right now, and I think we can see that a lot of artists are interested in longer duration projects which go beyond event culture, which kind of, it's interesting right now that many artists are working with farms as kind of projects with land, with farms. Otobong Nekanga, Yinka Shonibari in Nigeria, Adrian Villarojas in Argentina. It's many examples for that. Artists who work with gardens. We invited Alexandra Daisy Ginsberg to do a project for the Serpentine, and she proposed a pollinator garden. So we realized this project basically where, in collaboration again with AI, it was again enabled by AI, the artist created a garden, not necessarily for humans, but foremost for pollinators. So it was the biggest artwork we ever did in Kensington Gardens. And it attracted pollinators from all over London. It was a pollinator kind of meeting, and at the same time it could be enjoyed by humans as well. And so I would say that idea that artists want to work on more long durational projects is definitely a pattern we can see.
Is a big difference between the various parts of the world, or is art becoming more one global movement?
Yeah, that is kind of complex. I think in a way, artists, we live in an age which has more and more homogenizing forces of globalization, and we kind of have a counter reaction to that. We can see which are new localisms, which is a lack of tolerance, which are new nationalisms. So I think we've got these two extremes. Now we've got the extreme globalization and the extreme counter reaction. And I think the most interesting practices right now do what the Martinican philosopher Edouard Glissant, who has always been a big inspiration for me, called mondialité. They kind of negotiate ways of working which are kind of enabling a global dialogue, but at the same time are deeply locally anchored in a way. So they resist the homogenizing forces of globalization, but they also don't fall into this trap that one goes from the local into the localist and no longer is open for a global dialogue. Glissant calls this mondialité. So I think that's what the...
You read him every morning, I gather.
Yeah, exactly. That's a ritual, one of my rituals. Because that's one of the reasons why, because I want to think every morning how we can contribute to this idea of mondialité through what
you
we
read
do.
The same pages every day, or you read different pages?
No, he's got a very big body of work. He's written poems, he's written novels. He's written a very beautiful novel called Sartorius, about the people whose identity is really defined through relations, and at the same time he's also written on art. It's a very, very big body of work. One can always find new texts.
What can business people learn from the art world?
I think there are many things. I think, of course, artists are really good at pivoting, and I think today we live in an environment where it's more and more difficult to predict the future. So I think, in a way, the way artists work with the unknowable, the way artists work also with questions often more than with answers, is something I think which can be very relevant today. And I think it's interesting. In the 60s, there was this idea of John Latham and Barbara Stevini, where they had this idea of APG. They had this idea of an artist placement group, where they thought that every governmental structure, but also every company and every corporation should have an artist in residence and maybe also an artist on the board. And I think the time has come that we should realize that. I think it would be very exciting.
Do you ever think about the fact that you have to sell tickets?
I mean, we are at the Serpentine, we have free admission. We're in a park, we're in Kensington Gardens, and we want the experience to be for everyone. So we've always had free admissions, but we of course think a lot about visitor figures. We want the experience to be there for as many people as possible.
Does that influence what shows you put on? I mean, the fact that you need to have visitors?
I think the program has to be a mix. For our CEO, for Bettina Korek, for myself, for the teams, what is really important is that we have moments where we can show extremely well-known artists like David Hockney, or last year Peter Doig, or soon to come next year Lisa Bryce, alongside younger emerging practitioners. And I think the sort of a good program in the museum is a mix of that. It's a mix of new, unexpected position where visitors can basically discover artists they haven't seen before, and at the same time they can see artists maybe they already know, but from a different, unexpected angle. So it's about finding the right balance, finding the right mix, no? but also the program, because I think in your questions, I really like that question about what makes a good program. No? And I think your question leads in a way to that. It's the question of what makes a good program in an institution. I think it's about finding the right mix between very well-known artists whom one shows from an unexpected angle, new artists whom visitors can discover. But then at the same time also, if you want to understand the forces which are effective in art, it's important to somehow also understand what's happening in other disciplines. And that's also why for us, for example, it's very important that we have this dimension with architecture, no? Because if we look at Vasari in the Renaissance, Lives of the Artists and Lives of the Architects, which is the book, which is somehow the reason why I became a curator, because as a teenager, I would always read it, and I was like thinking, Vasari's book kind of gave me the idea that one could meet the artists of our time. Because that wasn't an obvious idea initially, but all of a sudden I kind of realized there are actually amazing artists out there of our time, and I could go and meet them. And that prompted, when I was 16, 17, this idea of visiting studios quite feverishly all over Europe. Of course, also having been so inspired by this book means that I always felt that we need, in a program, in a museum, to kind of connect art and architecture. And that's what we do with our pavilion. We are now in a 26th year. And initially, when the program started, when Julia Peyton-Jones began it in 2000 with Zaha Hadid, so the pavilion program began in the year 2000 with Zaha Hadid. It was really about artists who haven't built in London before, who haven't built in the UK. And that is still the rule of the game. But initially, it was very well-known artists, because it's interesting that London is such a global city for many different things, for business, for many art forms. But it's interesting, London has produced an extraordinary generation, or several extraordinary generations of architects. If you think of Zaha Hadid, if you think of Norman Foster, if you think of Richard Rogers, if you think of David Chipperfield, if you think of the Archigram Group, if you think of Farshid Moussavi, if you think of Cedric Price, and, right? So it has an amazing architecture scene here, but it was always quite closed for architects from abroad to build. And that's really what the Serpentine Pavilion tried to do from the beginning. It's inviting international architects for the first time to build here and open the discourse. But then, of course, at a certain moment, after about 12 years, in 2012, I joined the gallery in 2006, and then around 2012 we realized that the scheme had become very well known, and it would actually be a great opportunity now to open it up for a younger generation of architects. So we invited Sue Fujimoto, was the first younger architect we invited, who just last year, he's become very well known since and has done the Osaka, the famous ring, the biggest wood structure ever built. The year after, we invited the Chilean architect Smiljan Radic, who just was announced last month to have won the Pritzker Prize this year. And so that was 2012, 13, 14. And so over the last 12, 13, 14 years, we've continued in that direction. We've invited younger emerging practitioners. And that means we could also, through that, make the architecture discourse more diverse, more open, invite more female architects. It's fascinating, for example, that architects like Frida Escobedo, Orlina Gottmey, whom we invited, now went on to win very big competitions. Lina Gottmey won the British Museum competition. Frida Escobedo is building the foreign ministry in Qatar, is also building the new metropolitan wing. Sumaya Wali, who was the youngest architect we've invited, she was 29 when we invited her, is now involved in a very important bridge project.
So you were you were basically part of making them famous.
Yeah, and in a way it allows us to bring art and architecture together in an institution, and now it allows us also sometimes to have artists who actually have a desire to work with architecture to do the pavilion. For example, Olafur Eliasson, or also Theaster Gates were the artists who did the pavilion. Or last year, Marina Tabassum from Bangladesh, and this year it's a very young office from Mexico, Atelier Lanza, and that happens concurrently to what we do with visual art. And then we do the same thing with poetry. We connect a lot to poetry. We do the same thing also with music, as explained with Peter Dark. So in a way, we also believe that in a good program, or in a museum program, we need to show the visual art in connection to the other art forms.
Hans Ulrich, how has art changed
I mean, one of the things which has changed a lot, I think, over the last 30, 35 years that I've been in the art world is that we have very much a polyphony of centers now, and that's also being recognized. I mean, there has always been a polyphony of centers, but when I entered the art world, it was very limited to a few centers where basically the focus was. And I think today, and that happened through many new structures, that happened through the biennials, that happened through many new initiatives, through many curators, I think through many artists' initiatives. I think today we have incredible art initiatives on all continents, and we do have really a polyphony of centers. And that also means that for artists, I mean, the idea was always, what's the center of the art world? And after the Second World War, Paris lost the center to New York eventually. But I think that question of where is the center is redundant today, because I think artists can work anywhere today. I mean, and very often artists set up their own structures also, which I think is very important. The idea that artists create their own, artist-run spaces, their own initiatives, their own schools. So yeah, we do have, I think, a very strong polyphony in the arts today. I think the other thing which certainly has changed a lot is that there has been an increased number, I would say, of private foundations, of private initiatives, which have really created new possibilities and opportunities for artists. I think, when I began in the 80s, 90s, there were very few private museums, private foundations with exhibition spaces. And today, I mean, Norway is a great example. There is an increased polyphony of spaces, and I think it has contributed a lot to the dynamics, I think, in the art world. And I've been involved quite from the beginning in the Luma project, which is the vision of Maya Hoffmann in Arles, and I think that's a very interesting example for a very interdisciplinary art center, where art is also connected to ecology, where art is also connected very much to a local bioregion, where art is connected to design and to architecture. And part of my archive is there in Arles at Luma.
Is that where your archive will end up, you think?
I mean, for the moment, it's where the books are. Obviously,
how big is your archive?
It's maybe about 50,000 books. And it's a lot of papers and notes and things like that. But I think what is interesting is that obviously the biggest part of the archive is on the cloud and is on hard drives, because that's the filmed conversations. I mean, I suppose like the same with you. It's the archive of your podcasts, no? It's digital, no? And I think the question which I'm not yet sure, and which I'm very interested in exploring more in the future is, of course, what's going to happen with these more than 4,000 hours of conversations, because it is definitely, there is a great possibility that these conversations are more connected, and that because there is so many patterns, which emerge from this archive, and I think that's what I want to focus on.
I'd be so interested to run it through a proper AI model and bring out all the connections that we didn't, that we weren't aware of.
And in terms of the archive, I think one thing which is also kind of interesting is that, of course, there's so many artists in the archive with whom I spoke again and again, so there can actually be exhibitions just on one specific person from my archive, which we started to do, because in a way, if I have like 30 or 40 conversations with the same artist, that is almost like a project in itself.
Absolutely.
But I wanted to ask you about that. Do you think about to do something with your data set of your podcast? Because that's also an amazing data set.
Well, we have made a book out of it, and that's being translated now into German and English. So we'll see what comes out of that.
Yeah.
But for me, it's more important is what we have learned as an organization, and we have implemented many of the ideas and the findings into how we now work in the fund, and that's been important.
And do you have any unrealized conversations?
I think we all have unrealized conversations, even though there are fewer than before.
Yeah.
But I think it also develops because you have new technologies, you have new sciences, You have people coming up in other parts of the world, which I wasn't aware of. And so there are always people to interview. And I think it needs to come from your sincere wish to learn more, because you need to be interested in the person you meet. Otherwise, it's not going to be a good podcast.
Yeah.
Which is why I think this is so much fun, because I read about you, I read your books, I love what you do. And so that's such an incredible starting point.
And that is, of course, the paradox of people who don't want to give interviews. I once had a conversation with the artist Stanley Brown, who never gave an interview, about why he doesn't give interviews. And these are my unrealized conversations. On Kawara, who also never gave interviews, whenever I went to interview him, he said, "We're not doing an interview, we're playing chess." So, in a way.
Very good. Well, this has been an interview and not chess, that's for sure. So you talked about time. Some of the projects you've been working on has been going on for 30 years. Your relationships go back very far. Art is becoming more long-term. Just what is the kind of the offsetting forces of, on the one hand, continuing to do what you do really well and at the same time reinventing yourself? Because you need to do that as a gallery as well, right?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question about continuation and reinvention. I think
repetition and variation.
Yeah, or Deleuze wrote the book called Repetition and Difference. Yeah, I think it's a super interesting question. I think in a way, certain projects like the Pavilion are also our solo exhibitions where the artists take over the whole building and can create a kind of a Gesamtkunstwerk or can kind of show their world. They remain very relevant, but we always need to add new layers, no? And that's the kind of thing which I sort of mentioned briefly before, which means to also kind of introduce new departments, no? I think in a way, if you look at the organigram of museums, they're quite similar all over the world, and there are these different departments. And I think it's interesting that, given the fact that we live in a time of extreme change, how we can actually add new departments. And that's kind of what we did with technology. You know, we added a whole department. We now have 5 curators who work with technology. And for our CEO, Bettina Korek, for myself, it's super important, and for our teams, that we can actually, with this department, produce reality for artists, but also through the Future Art Ecosystem reports, which one can download from the Serpentine website for free, hopefully make the work we do with art and technology accessible for the sector. And I mean, the same thing happened with ecology. We worked very closely with the artist Gustav Metzger already around 2007. And he said it's extremely important that within an institution, there's a kind of an environmental dimension to the work. And so we've invited artists to do projects for Earth. To create projects for Earth, and have done that also over the last years. And I'm sure there are going to be new dimensions to that. I mean, another thing we realized, particularly during the lockdown, is the even bigger importance of art in the park. So the idea that actually people can see sculptures outdoors, because that was all people could visit during the lockdowns. They couldn't, the museums were closed, but one could see the art in the park. So that really encouraged us to do more of that. So it's kind of, there's always new dimensions added.
How do you continue to reinvent yourself?
In my own work?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a permanent process, I think, of reinvention, because I think every conversation, I mean, that's also the amazing thing of working with artists, is that it's very transformative. No, when we do a project with an artist, we are no longer the same person afterwards. We have to allow to be changed by it. So I would say the reinvention happens each single time when there is a collaboration with an artist. Yeah.
And how should we go about learning and reinventing ourselves based on exhibitions and art and music and poetry? What is the key?
As somebody who visits exhibitions, or like
just how should we think about our lives and our learning?
Yeah, I suppose the most important thing in terms of reinvention is openness. No, I suppose very often a lack of openness prevents us from that somehow.
Are we less open than we were in the past?
I think we always need to be more open. I think there is a tendency I think particularly fear of taking risk is certainly something which, because of course exhibitions which try to be new experiments can also fail. No, it's if an exhibition is a routine. I've always believed in. I mean, when I did my first exhibition in the kitchen.
You were how old? You were?
Yeah, I was like in my early 20s. I had already traveled and made all these studio visits, and then invited artists to exhibit in my kitchen, and 29 people came over 3 months, and the exhibition happened also in the fridge, and it was obviously a risk, and it was also a very big excitement because it was the first time. And I always felt that with every exhibition, it has to be that way. You know, it cannot be a routine, because if it becomes a routine, something gets lost.
What was the biggest risk you took? What was the biggest disappointment you had ever with an exhibition that just surprised you on the downside?
The biggest risk with an exhibition. I mean, we did an exhibition called Utopia Station, which was a truly utopic exhibition with Rick Tiermanet and Molly Nesbitt at the Venice Biennale, and it was basically in itself an utopia, and I think that was the biggest risk we took. Yeah.
And what's the exhibition that has surprised you the most on the upside that just like?
But I mean, I did at the same time think that exactly that risk with Utopia Station continued to resonate for a long time. I think for me, in addition to Utopia Station, another exhibition which was very which was really an experiment with an uncertain outcome, but which continues to, I think, continues to be inspiring, was when we did Laboratorium. There was an exhibition about art and science, and we wanted to basically look what is the laboratory of a scientist and what is the studio of an artist. We did that with Barbara van der Linden in 1999 in Antwerp, and we declared the labs of the scientists basically visitable. So we organized visits in these scientific labs. We organized studio visits, and we organized an exhibition where artists could basically work on this idea: what is a laboratorium, what is a lab, what is an experiment, and that continues to resonate somehow.
How much do you sleep?
More now than before. So basically, I had different experiments with sleep. So initially, when I began, I wanted to write many books, and so I was inspired by Balzac, because Balzac had this rhythm that he drank up to 50 coffees every day, and then and I realized that that's not really sustainable. I did it for about 6 months, and it was actually quite productive, but not sustainable. I mean, Balzac also died in his 50s, so it wasn't sustainable. Then I found out that there was the Da Vinci rhythm, and the Da Vinci rhythm is basically to sleep every 3 hours for 15 minutes. And that proved to be very productive, and also not very stressful. I was quite somehow balanced whilst I did it, but it didn't work when I started to have an office, because obviously in an office we need to, we can't then after 3 hours suddenly lie down for 15 minutes. It wouldn't work. Or we have meetings and then it wouldn't work. So then I stopped the Da Vinci rhythm. And then at a certain moment I realized that I needed, because I think we all have an inner kind of rhythm, and I needed about 6.5 hours sleep. So then I came up with this idea of having a night assistant, a night producer. So always after dinner in the evening from sort of 10:30 to 11:30, I would work another hour with the night producer, and who would then realize correspondence or transcriptions or editing overnight, and in the morning when I wake up, it's done. And so since I have this system in place, I can sleep.
You have it still?
Yeah.
So you have somebody, you have like an assistant who works during the night for you?
Yeah, so it's a 24-hour. So
you are like a totally international business machine and a proper IBM.
No, it's also quite creative and productive, because in a way I get another hour work done in the evening, and when I wake up in the morning, a lot of things are done.
It sounds pretty good. You also have something called Brutally Early Club.
So the Brutally Early Club began in 2006, 2007 when I moved to London, and we kind of realized that it's become quite complicated to make meetings with friends, because everybody is so busy, and so it always takes days and days to organize, and it has to be planned weeks in advance. so we thought, how could we do meetings which are more improvised? And then we came up with this trick. We thought if we do it at 6 in the morning, nobody can say that they have prior schedule. So we basically convened coffee meetings at 6:30 in the morning, and astonishingly, almost 100 people showed up, and it became a club.
How do you relax?
I would say to liberate time, for me it's a very relaxing experience to be in a studio with an artist and switch off all the phones and disconnect completely and just focus on a conversation and forget time. So I think that's a way of slowing down. I also relax through reading a lot, and jogging is very important, listening to podcasts.
And what's
listening to your podcast?
Yeah, I was very surprised actually that you do listen to it, but thank you. What is driving you?
I think what is driving me, I think that we live in a world, I mean, the departure point of what is driving me was and still is that I want to work with artists and realize their projects and enable their projects and support artists and their visions. No, so that's a driving force which never went away. But I think in addition to that, there is another driving force. I think we live in a world which is increasingly polarized and separated, and people don't talk to each other. And I think it's super important that we have situations where we can bring people together. And I think that's what exhibitions can do. I think that's what we're trying to do with our program at Serpentine. That's what I try to do with all my exhibitions. I think that idea of also breaking down silos and bringing different fields of knowledge together, going beyond the fear of pooling knowledge, I think that's very much a driving force.
Well, you've broken down more silos than most people, and you also created more shows and created more pleasure in life than anybody else I know. So big thank you.
Thank you very much.